all right. Well, here we are. It is Unapologetically Black Unicorns, and we have yet another episode with another fantabulous guest, and I would like them to introduce themselves. So, Nze, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Nze Okoronta. I am a Black queer person of Nigerian descent. I am based in Madison, Wisconsin, and I work at a Warmline hotline program, and I love working on peer support in crisis.
Awesome. Awesome. So this is just so fortuitous in this way that, the beauty of social media, I know there's a lot of attention now on social media and the harms of social media, but the beauty of social media is you do get to meet really interesting people and share really interesting stories. And on one of my platforms, I posted a blog post about, I think it was informed consent. And then I get these like heart emojis and, I'm like, who is this person? And I think you might have made a comment Tuesday. And then I reached back out and said, well, wait, what do you do? Tell me about it. And I have been to Wisconsin actually and visited peer respites there. I think I visited two. Don't think I went to where you are, but that's how we actually got connected. And that's why we've not met in person, but have been chatting about things in the peer space. So how did you get into all of this?
It's been a long, winding journey. I feel like the short version of that is I'm a person that has a heavy amount of institutional harm that I've experienced throughout my journey, mental health, substance use, all the things, just like what I consider to be like my life, the cards I was dealt. I did not have access to culturally competent services. I've been overprescribed, misprescribed, ill-prescribed, ill-advised, taught that I was an unreliable narrator for my own experience. And the majority of my healing path has been seeking my own personal meaning for what I make of my experiences and being in a state of active resistance against the narratives placed upon me. The long version of that is that I have a lengthy history in nonprofits and experienced also a lot of harm implementing equity-based programming, culturally responsive services, and I was actually working as a clinician, and I'm not a credentialed person. I was just doing a little substance use counselor part in my journey that ended quickly. And I ended up in a state of crisis when I was overseeing a Afrocentric strengths-based program for Black and Brown families. And I had no one to call because the people I would be calling would be my colleagues. So I called a Warmline, and in a state of being on medical leave actually at that point because of how severe things had gotten on my end. I was surprised when I walked in on my first day of a job and it was the Warmline I had called not even 6 months ago.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's first of all, I'm glad you called the Warmline, and I'm glad you found the support and care that you needed during such a rough time. So, and that you walked in and it was like, oh, wait a minute, your voice sounds familiar, or whatever it was that made you recognize it was the Warmline that you had called. So when you were going through that hard time and you're supporting Black families, is that when you were kind of realizing, not just because of your own journey, but also supporting other Black families, that, okay, wait a minute, this is not really quite working for us. We need something a little bit different.
Absolutely. The program was based on this premise that us as, quote, clinicians could do what's called self-disclosure, which I just think is real talk. I had been slated with calling the entire Warmline backup log for the clinical outpatient unit, and it was hundreds of people waiting, and it was in the wake of George Floyd. It was the summer 2020 and the pandemic. I was the intake coordinator at that time, and I was charged with doing things like suicide risk assessments and calling in people to see where they were at case management wise. And because of the self-disclosure, it was probably the only position it was my introductory to peer work as I would know it, as much peer as you can be in that setting. But I would come up against situations and say, I can't report this person. I won't, this is passive. This is not something to be acted upon. And because I understood on a personal level, some of the things the folks I was sharing with, I did not agree with the mechanisms they were asking me to enact upon my own community. I saw it as harmful. I saw it as deconstructive, and I saw it as opposing to the narrative our program stood for, which is resiliency and hope and cultivating the strengths of a people whose culture has been lost and discarded. And I could no longer do it faithfully. And it led me to vacating the position because I didn't believe it was ethical for me to be in that role as a person against my own community.
Yeah, I could see how that can cause so much emotional distress because it's like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So you have to make the decision for your own self-care and self-preservation. So when you kind of move forward to coming to the Warmline and doing that kind of work, did that feel closer to what you had hoped? Was there still something missing, nothing missing? Like, what was that like when you started this new thing?
So my story is actually really funny. I was just scrounging the bottom of the barrel on Indeed looking for jobs, and I saw a case manager role. And in my interview, I disclosed, okay, I've just done this peer training thing. My supervisor says, can I have an off the record conversation with you tomorrow? I have this other job I think you'd really like. And it was a supervisor role at the Respite Warmline I oversee. My first day, I did not even know we had a respite. I said, okay, I'll do this peer services thing. You have a community-based program. She says, yeah, go over and check the respite out. It's down the street. I think you'll really like it. There's some people there, hang out with the peers. And what I stepped into was unlike anything I'd ever known. I did not know what a respite was. I did not know what a warm line was. I took the job with no job description at all, really not knowing. And this is my life. It's been a series of blind steps out on faith in myself, being led sometimes by something I think is greater than me. In my West African culture, we call that kind of the direction that the gift that our ancestors bestowed upon us. That's my chi leading me toward what my destination is. And I didn't know what a crisis alternative was. I didn't know that's what it stood for. And I learned my job as I walked into it. And I was supposed to be in a cubicle in an office. And I came in the first day and I said, I want to work out of the house. And so I worked out of the house and I became deeply invested in something I saw as being severely neglected. There had been nobody on the site, really, nobody supporting the peers. There was no oversight when I came in. It was seen as kind of this extra thing that was maybe just not being tended to in the way that it was deserving of. And I poured my heart into it because it's where I figured out I would belong. And if something like a respite had been in existence when I was struggling, when I had my own challenges, my outcomes would have been very different. I fell in love with the respite and I didn't even know what I was walking into.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there are parts of our stories that are somewhat similar, right? Where I think the first respite I saw, I'm trying to remember, probably hadn't seen one. I'd had heard of these respites, these things called respites. And I was, thinking of my own journey or was still on my own journey. And every time I needed a little bit more support versus, than what's offered if you go into a community program, which is like you go in for a couple of hours and then you have to come home. And it was the coming home part, even though I live by myself, it was sort of this coming home part that it was like, but there's nothing here. There's no support here. I need a little bit more in the evenings and, to kind of get through the day, but there's no there. It's either kind of like hospital, day treatment, community program, like there's no there. And I was like, but we need a there. What's the there? And peer respite seemed to be what could be that place when you don't need hospital. That's not what I needed, but it was the only thing that could give me maybe that 24-hour for a couple days of possibly what I needed, but it wasn't the right level. So when we think about all of this in a cultural context, what does that look like? Because we were talking about the difference between like spas and sanctuaries and spa days and that kind of respite versus kind of the deep hard work we're doing from that cultural perspective and lens. So can you share a little bit about sort of those differences?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll first say I'm very familiar with the feeling of being in, like, I call it the eye of a hurricane. Everything's swirling around me and just this stillness, just this overwhelming sense of powerlessness, grief, sometimes rage, my sense of a loss of control within myself, losing touch with who I am. And I just needed someone to say that was all right, that was happening, or to not try and make sense of something that I couldn't make sense of, to not make sense of it for me.
Mm-hmm.
Coming to the respite, I knew this is an important place. I've had experiences with domestic violence. I've had experiences with housing insecurity. I didn't even have a car until a few years ago. I didn't come into this life with a lot of things. And the things that put me in crisis were not because of who I was, or not even necessarily the things that happened to me. It was the conditions around me were not conducive to me being able to live a sustainable life that was full of joy, or that even had much in it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see people coming into the respite, the first thing I think of is not what led you here, what have you been through? It's, what is the barrier? What is stopping you, and what is stopping the community from embracing you? Because I also just think respites would not exist if we had a society, had a community where people had their doors open when we're in times of suffering. So I
Yeah.
think the fact that it's standing, that it exists, is just, it shows that we have a lot of work to do as a people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you were talking about, sort of those structural barriers versus those looking at some of these issues of, I even struggle with the, and what happened to you kind of question, more around sort of, but what's happening outside that's impacting me versus what happened to me, because then it still puts it on me. And I'm hearing you say, but there are other things that are outside of the person that's impacting their emotional well-being and their physical well-being.
Right, absolutely. And I don't even use the term recovery for myself. Actually, I just tell people I have a hard time living in a body. I have a hard time being in this world. My mom is actually a teacher by trade. She's a special ed teacher. With my own neurodivergence, we developed systems that work for me. And she's a white woman who married a Nigerian immigrant. So she was the most imperfect teacher. But I think, just like in my experience, we teach the things we need to learn. And my dad's experience is, I think, how my mom was able to teach me. My dad had a significant trauma from being a soldier in the Biafran conflict in 1961 that freed Nigeria from British colonization. He came here as a scholar. He got a PhD. He is a musician playing like 20 different jazz instruments, highly gifted man. He's a Marxist communist. He was, we lived overseas as a child in London, and my mom saw, so I was born 6 months after Rodney King in Los Angeles, and my mom saw how that ravaged my father's spirit, not understanding the violence being done unto him. And his first attempt was when I was 3 years old, and he put me on his lap and took a bottle of pills. And it became a cycle of institutionalization, incarceration, and a man who went from being at the top of his fraternity, he's signed by Capitol Records at one point. He was a force to be reckoned with. Everyone knew him. All the Nigerian people that I know still know him, even the name is an old name. And he couldn't even hold a job as a custodian at a school after the effects of medications and how much his dignity had been stolen. And I grew up being very well aware that that was a risk for me. And my mom always said, your father was brilliant and he made some bad choices. He made some decisions in his life, but I've always understood that the conditions of which he was operating within were not built for him, Right. They wanted compliance and he wanted liberation. And I have always, I didn't think that my story would follow in his footsteps as closely. And I had my own version of what he went through. And I can't think of how it would have been if my mom had not known those disadvantages existed, everything from the neighborhood I was in, to the school district I went to the opportunities I had, the way I was regarded from having a different name that was clearly West African, people just misunderstanding my expressions as suffering and labeling them as harmful, a problem, abnormal, so many inappropriate, totally wrong connotations. And I needed a strong fighter to say, that is not what you're seeing. That's not the story here. And most of my life has been reclaiming that story for myself.
Wow. And now you're helping people reclaim their stories, right?
Mm.
Awesome. So talk a little bit about what happens when somebody comes into a respite. I know we, in our mental health field work, our advocacy work, our peer work, we use a term a lot, and it's like we're talking to ourselves, and we know what it means, but there may be people who are not clear about what it means, and more importantly, clear about what it means when you talk about the work that you do. So yeah, define a little bit about what happens sort of in a respite, or your respite in particular.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing about the people that come in is they all come by a variety of so many ways. I see the respite as almost a path of waymaking for people. It's this kind of self-navigation process I see that comes together so artfully. Some people come in because they were told to call here because some place was full. Some folks truly do just want a place to go because they are struggling with housing. And that turns into a very different conversation with some people when they're opened up to what we perhaps can offer, and they don't know that human connection is even available to them. They didn't know that would come with shelter, and that makes it even more rich for us, because some respites don't take folks that don't have housing.
Right.
We get folks who are fleeing dangerous situations, domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
We get people that come because they know this is a sanctuary. They know that the only real hard line here is, don't call the police on anyone. That is kind of a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
We get people that come because they're looking for peace and they're looking for choice. And some people have so many different reasons for showing up. But what I notice the common thread really is people want to be listened to. They want to be embraced. They want to be accepted. They want to be able to come as they are. So when someone comes in for a respite, we just sit and have coffee. Sometimes we sit on the couch. We're not rushing to do the paperwork. We are not, tell me what your date of birth is. We are not, putting them in a computer registry system. It's, hey, how are you doing? It's a normal conversation. It's like any other human being, I would agree, as if they walked over my door sill into my own home, into my own community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for a lot of the respites, at least many that I know, they're, can be funded by people who want a little bit more. Let's put it that way. Okay, come on. I'm just going to be blunt. This is my podcast. I can say whatever the heck I want to say. So they can be funded by, public dollars, like tax dollars. They can be funded by grant dollars from philanthropy. Sometimes that comes with those obligations of the things that you're talking about that you all don't do, which, is like, oh, we've got to do the documentation, or, oh, we have to put you in the computer system, or wait a minute, I need all this information from you. And I know at our respite, we were funded through taxpayer dollars. So then we have to be responsive to that taxpayer. So, we tried to flip how we did those things, even though we needed them, right? So we would have people, quote unquote, pre-register, leaving off some of the information that was we wanted to have more privacy around, so that when they came into the respite, we didn't have to start with, excuse me, but you need to fill out the registration form, but more like you're saying, let's have some coffee, let's chitty chat. We could gather some of the information that we needed for the form just in the conversation that we're having, and go fill it out later. And then when, the person was ready, we could say, there's a couple of other things that would help us, and blah, blah, blah. So we would find ways around still being able to meet some of these obligations. But so for other people who might not understand, again, these nuances, then how do you get funded? And then I'm sure for some people who are thinking far more traditionally, it's like, well, wait a minute, how do you get funded? Who pays for that? And what's the accountability? And oh my gosh, what's the security and all that kind of stuff.
So we actually are funded by the state, and all those things happen. It's so interesting. Ours is almost flipped. So the pre-screening, the qualifier is like, yeah, what's your name? I think we do ask date of birth. What are you looking to get out of respite? Can I tell you about peer respite? So it's a little bit of education sometimes. I just usually say, like, what are you working with? Tell me what you're coming in here with, or what had you making this call? What led you to us? How did you find us? And that usually opens up the floor. And then I'm usually volunteering information and laying out right away that I don't expect them to share anything they don't want to with me. I'm kind of trying to return that power and equal out that differential. And because I'm thinking, when I needed to go places, I do not want to see a big pamphlet with an intake survey and have somebody ask me all private information. When I'm overwhelmed, that process is unimaginable. If anything, I resent it, and it actually has stopped me from accessing services. So we're just having a conversation, and then I'm clarifying what a respite can and can't do. And then it's like, so you want to come? Okay, cool. Because what do you really need to know about a person before they step over your door sill? And then throughout the conversation, when they first come in, it is a welcome, it is a tour, it is kind of like meeting everybody around, saying hello, sitting down. And then I'm going to just kind of be real with people, like, okay, so, we have funding. There's some things that I kind of want to go over when it feels right for you. It doesn't have to be tonight, settle in, get your bearings, kind of relax, settle into the space, take a look around, do some art projects with folks. And, is there a time I can check in with you later, and we can kind of work through some of this stuff? And sometimes I read the forms out loud to people, and then they just sign them. Or I'll kind of say, this is the guest bill of rights. You want to read this on your own time, and you want to just sign here. So we figure out, people are very willing usually to go through that process. And also we have to structure it in a way where We're not sitting in an office at a desk with a clipboard. We are at the table doing a puzzle, playing checkers, baking a cake in the kitchen in the morning. And sometimes it's just, you're on your way out for the work. Could you sign this real quick? Like just real fast. And it's an afterthought. The point is the support. The paperwork is just so we can go through the motions, and I make it open that we're just checking off a box.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about something else we were talking about in relation to, folks of color in particular, and sort of how we go through different processes, how that feels different, looks different, and then our needs may also be different. I think you were talking to me about the focus of today, not today, the podcast, but today sort of in the United States in particular is around mental health and crisis. And so we were talking a little bit about, and respite does fit within sort of this array of quote unquote crisis or crisis support. I'll just put it that way. But we were talking about crisis and grief and that whole sort of an intergenerational trauma. You talked a little bit about the trauma with your that your father went through. So how does all of that kind of how do we talk about that in relation to how we experience that from a cultural lens?
Yeah, I think what I noticed, so my work is always inspired by the community that I work with. And I think the people that I work with teach me how to do my job. Actually, I'm learning from them what I need to be doing to provide support, and what, based on what they say is helpful, they say is beneficial. And in seeing reflections of myself at times, that's kind of where I came to where I am on how grief is related to crisis and how grief is related to intergenerational trauma. Some folks come into the respite and they're using very clinical language. I'm struggling with depression. I'm having a manic episode. And I will use the language that they say to me, and I'll tell them, you've shared with me that you identify as such, even if those terminologies are not what I personally relate to or how I make meaning of my experiences. And I love when I get a person that comes to the respite and says, I just lost my cousin to suicide, or my mom and I aren't talking. My kids and we're separated, and that is wearing on my soul. My nerves, I love when I hear what's really going on with that person situationally that's led them to feel the way they feel, because then we can really get into the grief and the losses that person has incurred, and how that's showing up in a state of powerlessness and leading them to feel like they don't have other options, like they don't want to be here anymore. I don't identify with a symptom paradigm for the context of my suffering any longer. I do not use symptoms even for myself, like anxiety. I say things like, I'm going really fast today. I'm feeling really low. My heart feels heavy. And when I use that language with other people that feel like I do, the depth of the conversation completely changes. It's no longer about what is wrong with a person, what needs to be fixed. It was really powerful for me when someone asked me, you're saying all these things and I'm hearing all these diagnoses and symptoms. How do you want to feel? I wanted to feel joy. I wanted to feel safety. What I said was, I want to feel home. I want to feel home. And some of the respite folks will say, God, I feel so at home. I feel like I know you, or wow, you're speaking my language. Like, that's my story. And it's really on that human level, from a cultural perspective, when we shift paradigm away from medicalized models and away from limiting beliefs, things that have boxed people into definitions of who they are and how they relate to themselves, like that's when we see what some people call a breakthrough. I call it, for myself, just not even like a reawakening, but I see it as a regenerative process. It's restorative for me. It's restorative justice for myself. It's a redistribution of power in my relationships. And when people come into the respite knowing that they can have a right to feel deep emotions and crisis about a breakup, their car going out, losing a job, like that is real. And it's not about, oh, I need to take my antidepressant, or when did you see your therapist last? It's, tell me what about your life? Like what is important to you about this? And what is that feeling around those things? And a lot of it's grief, a lot of it's loss, a lot of it is things ending, and a lot of it's things totally beyond that person's control. And if it is within their control, there's a sense of like, I'm bad, and I'm blaming myself for my very real, very visceral reaction to something that hurts and has a reason to hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so deeply human. That's part of the human experience. And I do also struggle with this idea of removing the natural human emotions and experiences into something that is over there, that, that sort of medicalized maybe approach that doesn't help us get back in touch with those feelings, because those feelings are going to happen again. They're going to happen again, and they're going to happen again. One last thing I do want to talk about, and that is that there's such an intentionality about what you all are doing, and we've heard it throughout the whole podcast. And part of it is around not using anything carceral.
Mm-hmm.
Share a little bit about that, because I'm sure people are like, well, what do you mean you never called the police? But what is something that, So can you talk a little bit about that so people can understand that that is possible?
Yes. I had a similar experience of feeling that my father was stolen from that thing that was called schizophrenia, that thing that was called schizoaffective. And he felt he was stolen from himself. And because he was stolen from himself, taken away from who he was, who he knew himself to be, with that language and the things they did to him because of how he was showing up. That was the MO, was carceral work. He became criminalized for his expression of suffering. And actually they were spiritual experiences. He felt he was talking to the ancestors. And when he was thinking he was being abducted by aliens, that came out of him being called an illegal alien. So and when he said he wanted to go home to his people, he meant, I want to go back to Africa. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of what it means to use a non-carceral lens, is the outcomes would have been significantly different for someone like my father and other people around me had these not been being used. And when I think about a person's choice being removed from who they are, it's so simple as asking someone, what do you think we ought to do? What do you think you ought to do? What do you need right now? Instead of just projecting my own fear and concern, my anxiety, when we're in states of powerlessness, that's the instinct of a lot of people, is to seize control over a situation, get it under control, even control myself. And I have that still, this desire to handle myself kind of, and make sure that I'm in line so that nobody comes and tries to get me in line. I think that we have a very militarized society. It's very generationally done to us, this idea that we're responsible for other people, because if we're not, then someone's going to become responsible for us. I think people are always trying to escape that inherent violence that lives in our community. So when I mean no carceral things, I mean we directly do not connect to crisis linkage. If crisis calls the respite and says, is someone here? Sir, are you lost? We are a closed record facility. We do, take information upon admittance, but those records are shredded. There's no reason for us to keep them here. Mm-hmm. To deliberately say, it's actually not in my role and it's actually against my values to do something to you. But what I can do is offer choices, and if something is going on with somebody and it's not okay for the rest of the community in the house, let's say other guests or other peers working there, other peer guests, like we're all people. We're going to have the discussion of, you could do that, but you just can't do that here. You can come back on doing that. Or just being real with people, like, I'm not an EMT. I am not trained in CPR. Well, I know CPR, but I'm not trained. I can't give you stitches. I can't sew you up if you decide to do this thing to yourself. And what you're saying to me is something that, I just break it down. We are regular people in a regular house on a regular street. So the things you get here is regular support. And if you're looking for someone to control or restrict you or alter the course of your path, your journey, you're not looking for peer support, but let's talk about where that might make sense. And if what you're asking from us is what human beings as us can do. And then even talking to them about how, I don't want to do that because that affects me too. That it hurts me to be put in a position for and over you. And I'm not comfortable with that level of responsibility over you. And I think it's sometimes the first time people have been asked to actually claim responsibility over themselves. And if they can't, then it's like, what do you need? If they don't want to, if they're not able to, what would be helpful? And what I find is just do less. If you feel the need to do something about a situation, that's my number one thing with staff is stop, pause, breathe. What do you need to do for yourself? Because if a person, their expression of suffering is challenging for you, there's stuff coming up for you, you feel this need to I just call it's that trigger finger that people have, that hairline, like they really feel like there has to be something to be done about this because we're trained in this culture of urgency, this culture of response. We are not trained in slowing mindfully. We are not trained in curiosity. We are not a community that does those things. We are a community that's trained to take action and to to execute something, you got to yield a result. So I always tell people, stay in your lane, do less. And if you feel you need to do something, maybe before you do it, ask that person, if I did this, would that be even helpful? Because people know what they need. And surprisingly, people have a hell of a lot more wherewithal about where they want to go. And nobody wants to be told what to do.
Yes.
People have never been given the dignity of being asked, you've made it this far. You've been through so many things in your life. How are you still standing? Have you felt this way before? And if so, what did you do? What was the result? Let's go back there. Let's remind people of their strength. Let's remind people of their power. Let's remind people of their agency and invite them to take agency with us, because my agency says, I can't be responsible for you. And I won't hold that. I can't carry that. What I can do is hold that with you, alongside you. I can witness that. Yeah. That's why I love crisis through a lens of grief, because with grief, words do not make sense. Action does not make sense. And when people come into the respite and they are grieving losses, they are grieving a loss of identity, a loss of personal meaning, a loss of dignity, a loss of a sense of direction over themselves, a loss of motivation, a loss of personhood is what a lot of it comes down to. To take any action in that space is the same thing as coming into someone's house who's grieving and trying to clean it all up. You're not going to make it better. In fact, you make it worse. What that person just needs is for you to be there and nothing more. And actually your presence, your silence, that is the gift.
Yeah. Yeah. The word listen and silent, same letters. I don't know if I always love that, because it reminds me sometimes the goal is just to be silent so I can listen. So if there is one last piece of wisdom, you've dropped tons throughout this whole conversation, but if there's something, we call this part the wisdom dropping before we wrap up, if there's one thing that you would like the audience to know and or do or think about, what would that be? What would you tell them?
It can be done. It can be created out of one person. I think I would tell them that it's possible. The world that you dream of existing, the reality you want to be yours and for your people, your community, these alternatives, the things that make sense for what you want to do with your pain and how you want to grieve with your people, you can build the world you wish to see. And it might start with one person. When I came, I don't know if I dropped the name, when I came to Solstice House, the respite that I work at in Madison, Wisconsin, it was a predominantly white staff. I think it was 2 people of color, including myself. And it was not being used the way it's being used now. The house was not a home necessarily, even to me. And to watch it grow in 2 years into a staff where we have 3/4 people of color. We got, more queer folks than just myself now. We got a couple people with unusual experiences, varying backgrounds, everywhere from age, early 20s into their 70s. We have 2 Black men overnight at the respite. We have Black elders in the house. We have people that have grandmother spirits at the house. The healing that you desire, they say build it and they will come. I say they will come if you say you wish to build it. You just have to know what the vision is. You have to follow the vision, stay anchored to the purpose. And when other people can't see that vision, you have to know there's other people looking to build just like you. You just don't know their names yet. And sometimes people need to be told that somebody else even wants to do that. And they need to know what it is. So I think it's possible. And, dreams are only dreams because they're not reality. And I've had the pleasure of having some of my own dreams realized. So dreams aren't just for nothing.
All right. All right. Snap, clap, thumbs up, the whole 9 yards. That was beautiful, beautifully said. And thank you so much for sharing your journey, sharing about the work that you do. And I hope giving hope to lots of people about the possibilities that are out there, that and that we can create it. Like you say, if you can dream it, you can make it happen. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nze, for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate you sharing your time with me. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, and for our listeners, you know what you got to do. There's the share, like, subscribe, comment, all that fun stuff. But the most important stuff is that you share the podcast with others, because this is such important information that I'm sure people would love to hear. Some need to hear it, of course. So we really want you to share the podcast with others. So thanks for joining us, and see you next week on Unapologetically Black Unicorns.